For about 25 centuries, there has been a settlement at the foot of the Beacon Hill near the confluence of the rivers Eden and Emont, though any evidence we shall see of such early beginnings is largely conjectural. Many later historical events and personages have left their impression on the town of Penrith. Penrith Town Hall owes much of its grace and beauty of proportion to its 18th century architect, Robert Adam. The building also contains the public library and the museum. A visitor to Penrith will gain much help and guidance in his search for information of historical interest if he visits this building. Here, at one time, lived William Wordsworth's cousin. In addition to the library and the museum, the building houses the recent grant of arms. The grant of arms is contained, in this case, on the wall of the council chamber, which is also used as the county courtroom. The museum contains an example of an early seal of the town. The cross of St. Andrew in the seal reminds us that Cumberland did not sever its connection with Scotland until the 13th century. The library also contains a photostat copy of the original charter. Penrith is the centre of a rich agricultural area and has been a market town from as long ago as 1223, when Henry III granted the town its market charter. The cattle market is one which brings members of the farming community from far and wide. From the cattle market to the town leads Castlegate, one of the several gates found in Penrith. As in most old towns, the word means a street, not a gate in the modern sense. The original market, the shambles and the stalls, was under the Moot Hall, and it was moved to the site of the Musgrave Monument about 1648. The corn market, it was specifically for grain, and Penrith had the reputation of being one of the best grain markets in the north of England. Rowcliffe Lane contains some 18th and even 17th century buildings, and may have once been the main street of Penrith rather than King Street. Here, it frames the monument, which was erected almost exactly a century ago by public subscription in honour of one of the Musgrave family. To the northwest of the monument, the old stocks were sited. The George Hotel, where the young Pretender lodged in the 45 rebellion, is situated on the east side of the main A6 road. There is the George Hotel, and Arnison's shop was once the house of Wordsworth's grandparents and the site of the old moot hall of Penrith. Sandgate is one of the old squares of the town and the site of the old cattle market. It was the scene of bull baiting up to the beginning of the 19th century. Penrith was noted for its breed of bulldogs. From Sandgate leads Burgate, where the horse fair was held, and this, in turn, leads into Middlegate. At the northern end of Middlegate is Robinson's School, which was built in 1670 under an annuity of £55 per annum left by William Robinson for the education of poor girls. There is the inscription over its door. The grammar school of ancient foundation was re-established in 1564. The old building, dating from the 16th century, is in St Andrew's churchyard. St Andrew's Church has a 14th century tower of immense strength, but the nave had to be rebuilt early in the 18th century. This accounts for the noticeable architectural contrast. Inside the church, the brass candelabra in the nave were presented to the townspeople by the Duke of Portland in 1745 as a reward for their loyalty during the Jacobite Rising. The beautiful stained glass of the east window. In the window on the north side is the only authentic portrait of Richard II. And in one of the windows on the south side are portraits on glass of Richard, Duke of York, and his wife, Cicely Neville. Many theories have been advanced to explain this group of stones, but to the people of Penrith, it's the giant's grave. This is the plague stone, which was used for the cleansing of money in vinegar during the plague of 1598 to contain the disease within the town. And in this field, over 2,200 victims of the plague were buried in a communal grave. It's now called the Plague Field and lies on the slopes of the Beacon. The Beacon is the outstanding natural feature of the town, and it's crowned by the Pike, which was built in 1719. It was last lit in 1745. In the country around Penrith are several churches and castles of historic interest. This one is Great Sorkle Church, dedicated to St. Cuthbert, whose body rested there temporarily. It's built somewhat in the nature of a stronghold. In fact, in the 14th century, the tower was used throughout the border wars. In the porch is a Roman altar found in the churchyard in 1890, and also a fragment of Saxon stonework. Barton Church, a 12th century church, is peculiar in that it has the tower in the centre. The original church was found to be too small, and in 1250 the south aisle was built, whilst half a century later a north aisle was added. Much of the present structure is modern, dating from about 1904. The road beyond Barton leads past the foot of Ullswater, and here is a delightful view looking down the lake. Close by is the village of Dacre. At least two of the barons achieved fame by carrying off and marrying local heiresses. Here is Dacre Castle, an early 13th century quadrangular building with 4 square towers. It was originally the home of the Barons of Dacre, whose heyday was before the Wars of the Roses. There's a room in the castle called the Room of the Three Kings. But the meeting of the kings of England, Scotland and Cumberland, though supposed to have occurred at Dacre, was before the present structure was built. Dacre Church was probably built just after the Norman Conquest, of stone from an ancient monastery nearby. The tower was rebuilt 150 years ago. In the churchyard are 4 crude statues of animals, each about 4 feet high. This one is a bear. Broome Castle stands on the south bank of the River Emont, near its confluence with the Lowther, and was built on the site of an old Roman fort of the 1st century AD. The date of the foundation of the castle is not known, though the keep was built about 1180, and its walls are 11 feet thick. The castle came by marriage to the Clifford family in the middle of the 13th century, and they held it for 4 centuries. The parish church of Broome is St. Ninian's. The name commemorates the preaching there of St. Ninian, a Romano-Briton who lived about 400 AD. This is one of the oldest church sites in the country. It was rebuilt and refurbished, as it can be seen today, by Lady Anne Clifford in 1660. Broome Chapel was also rebuilt by Lady Anne on the site of an ancient 13th century chapel. Today, it's famous for its medieval fittings, brought mostly from Flanders and Germany about a century ago by the 2nd Lord Broome. The Countess's Pillar commemorates the last parting of Lady Anne Clifford and her mother, the Countess of Cumberland, in 1616. One side of this 4-sided pillar contains an ancient sundial. Here, every year for 300 years has been performed the ceremony of distributing the Broome dole. The original intention of this was that it was distributed to the poor of the parish. Now, however, the distribution is made to the children of the parish. The money comes from the rental of a field which was in the property of Lady Anne Clifford. Broome Bridge long since replaced the ford, which was the reason for the siting there of the Roman fort and later the castle. Emont Bridge, some 500 years old, is about a mile or so upstream and marks the site of another early fording place. Nearby are 2 prehistoric relics. This one is Mayborough, a huge embankment 380 feet across with a solitary 10-foot monolith in the middle. It may be anything up to 4,000 years old and is certainly of an earlier period than King Arthur's Round Table, which lies across the road and is seen here. This is a round, flat space surrounded by a dried moat and described by Sir Walter Scott as a tilting ground. But more probably, it was a British or Saxon assembly place. This cottage in the village of Emont Bridge bears a Latin inscription saying that A brave man is at home wherever he treads. "5 miles to the south of Penrith is the facade of Lowther Castle, the former home of the Earls of Lonsdale. The present castle was built on the site of the ancient hall, construction beginning in 1802. Yanworth Hall, now a farmhouse, is a gracious building with a 14th century tower. At Greystoke also, there are battlemented buildings used as farmhouses, though these are of a much later period, being built about the time of the American War of Independence. This one is Fort Putnam. And here is Spire House. And the third one is Bunker's Hill. The date of the first erection of Greystoke Church is unknown, but rectors can be traced back to the 13th century. The church is of perpendicular style, the tower being rebuilt just over 100 years ago. In the south aisle, these two alabaster figures in plate armour are believed to be two of the Barons of Greystoke. The eastern stained glass window is a fine example of medieval art. The original castle of Greystoke was built in 1354. But the present mansion is only about 250 years old, though part of the older building may still be seen. Returning to Penrith itself, here are the ruins of the castle, now incorporated in Castle Park. It was built partly by Bishop Strickland and partly by the Nevilles. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who lived in great magnificence within its walls, added a later tower. By 1565, the castle was in a state of disrepair, and by 1700, it was in ruins. All that remains today is a portion of the Red Tower and some of the walls erected by Gloucester. The moat can be seen and the construction of the 4.5-foot thick walls. These are faced with sandstone on each side and filled with a core of rubble bound by lime and cement. The castle was large enough to harbour the population of Penrith in times of trouble. The only entrance was by the drawbridge. The Gloucester Arms is a very interesting example of Penrith's old houses and inns, its rooms being panelled in very old black oak. It was probably built earlier than 1580, when the house was owned by the de Weltville family. The fireplace here is late 17th century. The panels of the bar, not long ago, formed the ends of a bed in the Gloucester room above. The house became an inn in the early 19th century and was known first as the Golden Lion. The doorways and great fireplaces here belong to the Tudor style of architecture and are in the older part of the inn, which was formerly a cottage. In the same room there remains part of the wattle ceiling, which has been left as a sort of museum exhibit so that people can see how ceilings were made several hundred years ago. There it is. In Angel Lane, Robinson's butcher's shop has one of the many 17th and 18th century date stones in the town which bear witness to the prosperity of the district, consequent upon the establishment of peace with Scotland. The Crown Hotel is one of Penrith's old coaching houses. They're situated on the main A6. To the east side of the A6, and running almost parallel with it, is Friargate. And, as its name implies, it was associated with a house of friars. Here is the friarage, and the house of Austin Friars existed here as early as 1229, but was dissolved in 1539 at the time of the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII. It was here that Edward I twice gave donations to the friars, in 1299 on his expedition to Scotland. The first time he gave them 2 shillings and 9pence, and the second time 5 shillings and 6pence. There are many yards in Penrith, which, together with the open spaces like Sandgate and Dockery, were made to protect the people and their cattle from the attacks of the border raiders. The narrow streets and entrances made easier their defense by the inhabitants. This is Corney House, a good example of a substantial 17th century house taking its name from the Corney family. One member was a church warden in 1719 when the parish church was rebuilt, and apparently borrowed some of the old masonry, as the outbuildings include an interesting arch with medieval carved stones. This old window can be seen in Little Dockery. And this one is part of the little old sandstone house reputed to be the oldest house in the town. It was built by Roger Bertram in 1563. It now forms part of the Tudor Cafe. Bishop Yards is a reminder that long ago the bishops of Carlisle had a manor in Penrith which was known as Bishop's Row. Here is a Georgian house there. Here on the Scotland Road is Cockle House, where John McAdam once lived. McAdam's methods seem to have been forgotten. Here, Carlton, is the house where Anthony Trollope lived from 1839 to 1843. Finally, we go to the Two Lions Hotel, once the house of Gerard Lowther, and built in about 1585, perhaps by the same builder who built the Gloucester Arms, but the plans are very similar. Inside, we see some fine old fireplaces, and indeed an ancient key. And there the seal, marked 1586. This film has tried to show how the history of England has impinged on and influenced, however remotely, the history of a small market town. There is much of interest that's had to be omitted, and more facts doubtless still remain to be discovered by the diligent native of or visitor to Penrith.